Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to have this opportunity to speak to you all tonight. I've been kind of thinking about this topic in this lesson that I'm going to present for a while now, and it's something that I'm really excited to share with you all tonight. And so, recently, Colton, and throughout this year, he's been doing a series, That You May Believe. And basically, the main premise of this series is to basically give us all arguments and basically different ways that we can understand our own faith better, but also so that we can communicate our faith and arguments for that faith to other people. And that's an extremely important thing that we should consider. But another question that I think we also have to ask is not only, basically, is God real, but another question we ought to ask is basically, how do we know which God is real? Because actually, the Pew Research Center estimates that in 2019, there was an estimated 4,200 religions in the world. So there's a ton of different beliefs out there. There's a ton of different gods. There's a ton of different religions. And whenever we're talking to a skeptic, an answer that we're going to have to give to them is, why Christianity? Why Christianity out of thousands of the world's religions out there? Why do you believe that your religion is the true one? And of course, whenever we're going to make the claim that Christianity is the only true religion, we need to have a good defense to back that up. And so that's kind of what we're going to be looking at tonight, specifically giving us one way that we can know that Christianity is set apart, that it's different from these other religions, and that it does truly come from God. And one of the ways that we can do this is through prophecy. If we have these prophecies inside of the Bible that are predicting future events that happened hundreds of years after it was written in specific and neat detail, that's a pretty good indication that what we're looking at, isn't just something that's man-made and something that's fake, but it's something that does, in fact, come from God. And so what we're going to be doing this evening is we're going to be looking at two prophecies that kind of go in line with each other in Daniel's chapter 7 and chapter 8. And we're going to be spending basically all of our time here looking at this chapter, looking at these chapters. If you'd like to take notes, this is a great lesson to do that, because we're also going to be comparing these prophecies to what has been documented by other historians and what we know to be true whenever we look at world history. But before we get into the specifics of this prophecy, it's important that we kind of understand some background information on the book of Daniel before we get into anything. Now, first of all, we need to understand that Daniel is considered to be apocalyptic literature. And whenever we have apocalyptic literature, similar to like the book of Revelation, some people consider the book of Ezekiel to be apocalyptic as well, we have to be very careful with how we interpret these visions and these prophecies and these things that are this very figurative language that's being used. We don't want to draw some incorrect conclusions about these prophecies that can lead to some pretty strange just doctrines and ideas. So tonight, I'm going to try to be as careful as I can to analyze what these prophecies and visions are saying and to interpret them in a correct manner. And the second thing is Daniel, he lived with King Nebuchadnezzar. This was roughly about the about 600 to 500-ish BC. And the most important detail here is that Daniel, the book was written around 530-ish BC. Now what's interesting is a lot of people actually try to critique the date of Daniel. A lot of people try to argue that Daniel was written sometime between 165 and 150 BC. And the reason that they try to argue that the date is different is because Daniel so perfectly predicts what happens in world history that if they agree that the book of Daniel was written in 530 BC, they have a huge problem basically discrediting the Bible because of how accurate these prophecies are. But with this basic background information established, let's actually get into the text and what the Bible says, starting in Daniel chapter 7. Let's look at Daniel chapter 7, starting in verse 1, and we'll go to verse 6. It says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were sitting up the great sea. And four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear, was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, "Arise, devour much flesh." After this I looked, and beheld there another like a leopard, with 4 rings and a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And Daniel actually goes on in the next few verses to talk about the next beast, this 4th beast. Tonight, just for clarification, we're not actually going to be getting into this 4th beast, even though it's kind of really the really interesting one, really for 2 reasons. A, just for the sake of time, I don't actually think I have enough time to get to that 4th beast. But secondly, there's actually kind of a lot of confusion on what that 4th beast actually is. Is it talking about a kingdom of Rome? Is it an unfulfilled prophecy? Is it talking about a king named Antiochus, which we'll talk about a little bit later? It's not very clear. So there's a lot of conjecture, a lot of opinion around the 4th beast. So for that reason, we're going to be avoiding it tonight. But it is pretty clear, I think, what these first 3 beasts are talking about. But let's kind of go into the interpretation of what is he talking about whenever he's talking about this idea of a beast. Well, he actually answers this question a few verses later in verses 15 through 18. So in verse 15 of chapter 7 it says, "As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made me known to me the interpretation of these things." I'm going to stop here real quick. Basically what's happening here is Daniel, he's confused, he's anxious, he's not really sure what he just saw and what was just revealed to him in the first few verses. So it seems like he's asking an angel or something like that to basically clarify and explain to him what the prophecy is. So going back into verse 17, it says, "These 4 great beasts," this is the explanation, "these 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever." So whenever we're talking about these 4 beasts, we're specifically talking about 4 different kings, or I guess kingdoms alike. So whenever we're looking at these beasts, we need to remember that we're looking specifically at a king or a kingdom. So let's look first at the first beast. Now we see a few attributes that is laid out talking about this first beast of Daniel. First of all, we can see that he was like a lion, and then he had wings of an eagle that were later plucked from him, and then he was made to stand like a man and also had a man's heart. And just an interesting thing about the idea of a heart, that word can also be translated as mind as well. So man's heart, man's mind, that's kind of a synonymous idea whenever we look at the text of the Bible. But who is this beast talking about? Well, I think it's actually pretty clear that this beast is talking about the king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who Daniel was essentially working for. And there's a few reasons why we can see that this is true. First of all, he's actually referred to as a lion multiple times, once in Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 7, and another time in Ezekiel chapter 17, verse 3. So we have other prophets, other inspired prophets of God, who are also calling King Nebuchadnezzar the same thing and referring to him as the same idea as a lion. And what's also interesting is that lions themselves was something that was very common in Babylonian art. That's something that was very common. In fact, King Nebuchadnezzar himself built this beautiful wall that had lions all over it, although the name of the wall escapes me at the moment. And then we see that the wings were plucked from him. And this is an event that's also recorded in the book of Daniel. It's recorded in Daniel chapter 4, where basically you have this lion, which is the king of the animal, or king of all mammals, king of the animals, and then you have eagles, the king of the birds. So, King Nebuchadnezzar, he's this great emperor, he's this great king. He was actually created, many consider him to be the first world emperor at the time because of he was the amount of land that he amassed during his reign. And so we have this great king, but his wings were plucked from him. And in Daniel chapter 4, we have this account where King Nebuchadnezzar is going out, he's looking at the city, he's seeing how great it is, and he gives this long speech where he's basically saying, "Look at my kingdom and look how awesome I am." And then we know that God basically said, "No, that's not okay." And he went insane, his hair grew long, his fingernails became long as well. And although he was still the king, he really didn't have any, he didn't really have any capacity mentally to be the king either. And it wasn't until later that it just suddenly clicked after years that no, he wasn't great, but that God was great. So we can kind of clearly see that this is talking about Nebuchadnezzar. But you might be thinking, Jackson, this isn't prophecy. And that's actually true, because these events happened contemporary to the time of Daniel. You know, Daniel lived with Nebuchadnezzar. He saw him quite often. In fact, he lived even after Nebuchadnezzar passed away. So it is true, this first beast that we're looking at here isn't really a prophecy. It's just kind of documenting events that are happening during Daniel's lifetime. But what this first prophecy, or what this first beast does provide to us, it does provide us a way that we can kind of interpret and understand the subsequent beasts that come after the first one of Daniel. So who is the next beast, or who is the next king that Daniel is concerned with here? Well, I believe that the second beast of Daniel, some of you might have heard of him. His name is Cyrus the Great, who was the emperor of the Medo-Persian Empire, which was around 538 to 331 BC was the time frame that the Medo-Persian Empire was basically the world empire at the time, the greatest nation in the entire world. And in the text, and in this vision, we are told that this bear is raised up on one side. And this is something that's interesting about the history of the Medo-Persian Empire, is basically during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the Medo-Persian Empire, or I guess just the area of Media, was really divided into two kingdoms. There was the Medes, who were higher up. They were in control. They were in charge. And then there was the Persians. And the Persians were below them. They were not as powerful as the Medes were. And what happened was King Cyrus the Great was the king of Persia, and he eventually overthrew the king of the Medes, and he became the united emperor and king of all of Persia. He called his entire empire that of Persia. We also see in the vision that this bear had 3 ribs in its mouth. And I guess something went wrong whenever I was putting together this PowerPoint, but those 3 ribs are supposed to represent Babylon, Lydia, and the third thing that I didn't put into the PowerPoint is supposed to be the kingdom of Egypt. So these 3 ribs are the 3 kingdoms that were captured and that were conquered during the time of the Medo-Persian Empire. And then we can also see that in the vision, this beast, this bear, is told to arise and to devour much flesh. And that's exactly what happened. He took over Babylon, took over Egypt. It became the most powerful empire in the entire world, really that the world had ever seen at that time. And then finally, we have this third beast that we're going to be talking about. And this is a leopard. And this leopard is Alexander the Great, who was the king of Greece and Macedonia from around 336 to around 323 BC. And so this leopard, we can see that it has 4 wings. And whenever we think of the idea of 4 wings, the idea that comes to mind really is just the idea of speed. That, this leopard, leopards are fast, but 4 wings, leopard with 4 wings, that's a really fast beast that we are talking about here. And this is something that's really accurate to how Alexander the Great basically conquered the entire world. Alexander the Great became king whenever he was 20 years old and amassed the greatest empire the world had ever seen at the age of only 32 years old. So he basically captured a lot of the known world in a span of 13 years. And to really put this into perspective, it took King Nebuchadnezzar 13 years just to take over and siege the city of Troy, just a city. Alexander the Great was able to capture and conquer the entire world in that same period of time. So he was able to do things quite fast, and that was something that was very typical of Alexander the Great. Now, another thing that should be noted about this leopard is that it also had 4 heads. And it seems pretty clear that these 4 heads represent 4 generals that came after Alexander the Great. See, Alexander the Great didn't have an heir that could take over the kingdom, and so after he died at the age of 33, what happened was there was 4 generals that basically split up his empire and took control after Alexander the Great died. And then we can also see that the Bible says that this 4th beast was given dominion. Similar to the bear, he basically took over the entire world. Now, whenever we look at these first three beasts, we can kind of notice that a lot of what I'm doing here it probably makes sense to me. All of this seems very reasonable, but it's not something that's really specified in the text itself. Some of this is arguable. Some people could interpret it maybe differently. However, whenever we look at what happens in chapter 8, it becomes abundantly clear this is exactly what Daniel is talking about, and we're much more sure on what this prophecy and what this vision actually means. So let's go ahead and now turn over to chapter 8. That's where we'll be spending the rest of our time tonight, looking in chapter 8 of Daniel. So let's start with chapter 8, starting verses 1 through verse 4. It says, "In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in the Susa citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great." Now, this ram that these first 4 verses are talking about, it sounds very similar to the bear that was discussed in chapter 7. But we don't actually have to guess here. It's actually interpreted to us and specifically told this is talking about the Medo-Persian Empire. If we flip over to verse 20 of Daniel chapter 8, it says, "As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia." So we know specifically that whenever we're looking at these horns, one of them is higher than the other and one of them is lower, that we're looking at the 2 kings of Persia. And remember, Cyrus the Great was this lower horn, and he came up last. But he also came up last, and he was higher as the vision states. So this is specifically talking about King Cyrus the Great of Persia, and how he conquered basically the world. Now, the next vision goes on to verse 5, or not the next vision, this is the same vision, but the next animal that is discussed. In verse 5 it says, "As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes." So without touching the ground here, this goat is moving really fast. It's going quite quick. And verse 6, "He came to the ram with 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven." And so this seems like like we saw last, how this ram was talking about the bear. This seems pretty evident. This seems very comparable to the leopard, the fast leopard that we saw in chapter 7. And this is exactly what the Bible is talking about. Just like with the bear, it's actually specified that this is talking about the Greek Empire. Going down to verses 21 and 22 of chapter 8, it says, "And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king." And this is something that's interesting about Alexander the Great. We hear about the kingdom of Greece, and it existed for a very long time before Alexander the Great. However, it wasn't actually ever united. There was a bunch of different states. You've probably heard of Athens and Sparta, and they never really had a united leader or king or empire. Alexander the Great was the first one to come around and basically take over and unite all of Greece. So he was really technically the first king of Greece. But in verse 22 it says, "As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power." And so this is specifying that these 4 horns that it's talking about that are broken after the first one, this is representing the 4 kingdoms, or basically the 4 generals that are going to take over after Alexander dies, but none of these kingdoms are going to have the same power or authority or influence that Alexander the Great has. And something that's interesting about the idea of a goat is Alexander was actually named Alexander Agus, which literally means son of the goat. And Alexander wasn't just the king of Greece, he was also the king of Macedonia. And there's a lot of, in Macedonian mythology, there's a lot of influence of the goat in that as well. It's also talked about how the goat is said to be flying from the west, so it's going really fast. And, we think of Greece not really as being a Western country, but, from Israel and from Persia and from Egypt and all these other nations, Greece is to the west, so it's flying from the west to the east and taking over the world, and that's exactly what Alexander the Great did. And then we can see that it also says when the king becomes strong, that he will be broken. When the horn becomes strong, it shall be broken. And this is basically exactly what happens. Alexander the Great pushes his empire and pushes his army as far east as even India, but whenever he kind of got to the height of his empire, he basically just suddenly, he died at the age of only 32 or 33 years old. And the reason why is probably because of fever, probably because of malaria, something like that. He was fighting on the front lines with his troops the entire way. He was walking through the Iranian desert, so he was probably really just worn out, and he died because of that. And one thing about Alexander the Great is that he really was kind of a jerk, because whenever he was dying, he was asked, who's going to take over your kingdom after you pass away? And his answer was, I'm going to give it to the strong. And as you can imagine, that didn't really leave the nation in the most stable state as to who was going to take over. And so what ended up happening was you had these four generals kind of fighting for influence, and it eventually got divided into four main kingdoms. And here's a picture. I don't know how clear that is on the screen, but those are the four kingdoms. You have the Seleucid Empire, kind of what Persia was. You have the Ptolemaic Empire, which was most of Egypt. You had the Macedonian Empire, which was Greece. And then you also had the Pergamonic Empire, which was really most of Western modern-day Turkey. So those were the four kingdoms that split off from Alexander the Great. And then finally, we have this interesting vision about the little horn that comes after this leopard. So let's look at verse 9 in Daniel chapter 8. It says, out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. It grew great even to the hosts of heaven, and some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. Now, talking about this idea of stars, this kind of seems like it might be talking about angels or something like that. I think the correct interpretation when it's talking about how it's pulling down stars and trampling on them, it's actually talking about the Jews. It's talking about the holy people. If you go to Daniel chapter 12, it also references the holy people being called stars. So in context, that's something that seems to make sense. But moving on, in verse 11, it says, it became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and hosts to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. And whenever it's talking about the sanctuary in that passage, it's specifically talking about the temple that the Jews worshipped in. So who is this little horn talking about? Well, first let's go to the interpretation that's talked about in verses 9 through 14. Or actually, this is just a continuation of the same vision. In verse 23 it says, and at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and shall be broken, but by no human hand. The visions of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. So whoever this vision is talking about, I think we can all clearly see that it's not talking about a good guy at all. This guy does not sound like good news. He's someone who's desolated the temple. He's somebody who has sinister schemes. He's somebody who has power, but it's not his own. He shall destroy many. He shall rise up against the prince of princes himself. So he's rising up directly against God. So this is not a good guy, whoever this is talking about. And the one man in all of history who fits these descriptions to a glove, almost perfectly, his name is Antiochus Epiphanes, also known as Antiochus IV. Now, Antiochus IV, he lived roughly, we don't actually know if it was 215 when he was born, it was around that time, but we do know that he died in 264 BC. And now, Antiochus Epiphanes, he was the king of the Seleucid Empire. So remember, Alexander the Great's kingdom, it was split into 4 kingdoms. One of them was the Seleucid Empire, and Antiochus was emperor of that region. And we can see that he gains power through sinister schemes. However, his power is not his power. And this is exactly how Antiochus Epiphanes came to control the Seleucid Empire, because it wasn't actually supposed to be his kingdom. It was actually supposed to be his brothers. And so one thing about Antiochus, he was actually basically a political prisoner in Rome at the time. And remember, Rome during this time was basically the world empire and controlled most of the world. And so Antiochus was sitting in Rome, but through basically a deal that he was somehow able to arrange with the Romans, they sent his nephew in his place. So Antiochus was able to go back to the Seleucid Empire, while his nephew, who was the heir of the kingdom, was sent to Rome. And then later, his brother was assassinated, not technically by Antiochus. However, through a bunch of deals that he was able to make, Antiochus later became the emperor of the Seleucid Empire. And remember, it was supposed to be, first of all, his brother was killed. It was supposed to be his nephew. But through these deals, remember, Antiochus was able to basically switch places with his nephew. And so I know that's kind of a lot of details, but to put it this way, and just the point I'm trying to make here, is that this guy was not a good guy. He was someone who was familiar with sinister schemes. You know, he wasn't like Cyrus the Great, who took over Persia basically just through brute force and, you know, just conquering all the cities and towns in his path. This guy became emperor because he was just not a good guy, making, you know, shady and sinister deals. So his power was not actually his power. He wasn't supposed to be king, but he did end up becoming the emperor. And then it says he shall prosper and thrive and destroy the holy people. And of course, the holy people that he's talking about in this passage is the Jews. And this guy, he hated the Jews with a passion. It seemed like it was his life's mission and purpose to destroy Judaism and to hurt the holy people as much as he possibly could. And so here's just kind of a laundry list of just a few things that he did. First of all, he made Judaism illegal. He burned copies of the Torah. He sold the position of the high priest. He didn't do it once, he did it twice. So he sold the position to people who, you know, weren't qualified to be a high priest. In fact, one of them, his name was Jason. He was actually someone who wanted to basically Hellenize or make the temple more Greek, and he even erected a statue of Zeus inside of the temple itself. And then he also made the temple unclean. He did this by sacrificing pigs on the altar, which we know from the Bible, something to be unclean. He also, in many cases, even forced the Jews to eat pigs. And so everything that he did here was really just specifically to spit in the face of the Jews and the holy people. He didn't actually really need to do these things. He just did so because that's how much he hated the Jews. And just a reason why was probably just because of frustration and anger. He was somebody who wanted to conquer Egypt. The Roman Empire basically stepped in and said, no, you can't take Egypt. And whenever he was confronted about taking Egypt, he was asked by the Roman emperor, you know, are you going to attack or are you going to go back home? And Antiochus says, his response was basically, I'll think about it, I'll consider it. And the Roman general, he took a sword, he drew a circle around Antiochus and said, you're going to give me your answer before you walk out of the circle. And so, you know, he was forced to go back home. He was humiliated by the Romans. And so this is a reason why a lot of historians believe that he started just attacking the Jews, because that was the region he was in control of. And, you know, he was just frustrated and humiliated from that. And that's why a lot of historians believe was the reason he did all of these horrible things against the Jewish people. And so whenever we look at just the laundry list of all the things that Daniel correctly predicts in chapter 7 and chapter 8, we can see a few things that are predicted perfectly. We can see that he predicted the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire, how there's these two horns, how one of them is going to come up over the other, how it's going to devour much flesh. That was, perfectly predicted. Then we see the rise of Alexander the Great, someone who conquered Persia, someone who conquered the entire world in a span of 13 years. And then we see that it accurately predicts the splitting of Greece into 4 different kingdoms. It gets very specific onto what happens, how at the peak of the Greece's empire, whenever that horn becomes strong, it breaks and it separates into 4 kingdoms. And they are not as great as Alexander and as their first king. And then we see specific details on the reign of Antiochus IV. How he was somebody who was sinister, somebody who didn't actually deserve to be in power, but was somebody who decimated the temple and just even went against God himself. And one thing I didn't put on there, but something that's also interesting is in chapter 8, it specifically says that Antiochus died by non-human means. And so that's something that's kind of vague. We don't really know exactly what that means, but we do know what it doesn't mean. If he was assassinated, or if he was killed in a rebellion, or if he died in battle or something like that, then he wouldn't be killed by human means. However, Antiochus, he basically just suddenly got sick and died, kind of similar to Alexander the Great. And so we don't know exactly how he died, but we know it wasn't done by a human. And then we can also see the desecration of the temple and how that did happen under Antiochus's rule, and that eventually did lead to something that's known as the Maccabean revolts that happened after and during the reign of Antiochus IV. And the thing that's so interesting is that these events were predicted hundreds of years before they ever happened. Remember, Daniel was written around 530 BC. He's predicting events like Alexander the Great. He didn't become king of Greece until around 320-ish BC. So he's predicting events that happened hundreds of years after he actually lived, with not just kind of vague details like this is kind of what's going to happen, with specific details that can't just be guessed on and you can't just get lucky on. And so the point that we're really trying to get at here ultimately, by looking at all these details, it's kind of just interesting. Like I personally, if you can't tell, I'm interested by history. I like all these facts. I like kind of analyzing world history and how it compares to what is documented inside of the Bible. But it's not just something that's interesting, but it's also something that really just gives us reassurance for our faith, and that the religion that we believe in Christianity, that's not something that's just made up, but it's something that is directly inspired and comes from God. I didn't put this in the PowerPoint, but if you'd like to turn to 2 Peter chapter 1, 2 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 21, at the very end of the chapter, it says, "For no prophecy was ever produced by the will of man, but men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit." So we can see very clearly that whenever we're looking at prophecies in Daniel and the other thousands or hundreds of prophecies that are also made in the Bible, we're not just looking at this guesswork that's done by human beings. Because if it was just guesswork, and if this was fake, and if it wasn't inspired by God, there is absolutely zero chance that we would get these perfect details documented and written down by someone like Daniel, who lived in 600 to 500-ish BC and wrote the book of Daniel around 530 BC. But the reason why we have these specific details, the reason why it does match up with world events, is because it does come from God. And that's something that we should really take to heart, that whenever we're reading the Bible, that whenever we're reading these prophecies, that whenever we're practicing our faith, we're not just doing something that's fake, but we're doing something that does come directly from God. And that's something that not only can be used to convince others of the faith, but it can also be used to edify our own faith as well. And remember that we are worshiping and we are following after the true God of the Bible. So I know tonight really hasn't been, I guess, a typical lesson and something that we're maybe more used to, a little bit different, but I do think that it's been good for us to kind of consider these details, maybe gain more knowledge, some stuff that we didn't know before, and ultimately to build up our faith for ourselves and possibly for other people as well. But we do not want to end tonight without an invitation. If there's anybody here this evening who needs to obey the gospel and to come forward and be baptized, or if there's somebody out here who hasn't been living their life according to the word and would like to receive the prayers of the congregation, you do have the opportunity now as we stand and as we sing.